record on this computer. All right, bro. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. All right, so my name is Serrano, PhD candidate in sociology and critical race ethnic studies here at Santa Cruz, and I use pronouns he, him, his.
Dope.
And
And then tell us about él, because I feel like I see it often, but I don't really. Is it just a Spanish pronoun?
yeah, just Spanish pronoun.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, tell us a little bit about your research.
Yeah. So I'm a sociologist of children and youth, social movements, and gender and masculinity. But I broadly kind of engage in critical carceral studies and theories of intersectionality and critical youth studies. And so most of my work is concerned with questions around Black and Latino young men's contemporary experiences with the carceral state, but also masculinity and gender amid carceral expansion. So here in South Central. So my past 3 years now of work has all been in South Central LA. And so both looking at that, but also how young people or how Black and Latinx youth resist and organize against criminalization, policing, and the logics of the carceral state. So both looking at the work that they do in school districts, so in LAUSD, around currently defunding the police, but more broadly, right, trying to end criminalization and punishment, and then countywide, right, doing that same kind of work. And so it's kind of like both a kind of interrogation of how the social organization of South Central, its carceral history, but also its history, its really rich history of activism and social movements shapes and mediates the lives of Black and Latino young men.
Can you tell us a little bit just about the work that the youth have been doing? Because I know there's really exciting stuff going on down there.
The current work on defunding the police?
Yeah.
So here in LA, there's been work happening, right? I think LA, like many cities, unless thinking about South Central or in LA more broadly in the past, I want to say decade or maybe around 8 years. Some of the first chapters on Black Lives Matter were started here, also led by youth at the time and some adult allies. And so the past 10 years has seen a really rich history of young people getting involved in multiple ways to organize around policing and criminalizing, right? And so it began by little things they're not little, but
it might seem minuscule.
Yeah, they might seem little, or they might not be aligned with what we think about when we say current moment, right, defunding or abolishment. But definitely things like passing the School Climate Bill of Rights, right, which begin to outline the kind of campus climate that young people are experiencing in schools, and then little things like here and there that propositions or motions and so forth that just kind of slowly begin to take stabs at the carceral state, right, and its logic in schools. And so more recently, they've been working closely to organize. So this is many coalitions, and then we have student orgs youth orgs like Students to Serve, the Black Lives Matter Youth Vanguard, the coalition that I work with, Brothers Themselves, and just others who have been mobilizing really quickly to find those kind of entry points, right, to be able to go in and do work on defunding the police with a larger vision and goal of trying to abolish school police, right? And so LAUSD is one of the few school districts in the country to have its own police force. Mm-hmm. So the LASPD, right, the Los Angeles Unified School Police Department. And in some cases, LASPD is a much larger police force than cities have, right, to kind of give you a sense of the far reach or power LASPD. And so recently, um, what some of us are calling, I think in the work, like kind of, I don't know if we want to call it a post George Floyd moment, but definitely a moment very much tied to George Floyd murder, and then the uprisings that happened right after, and then of course, and Breonna Taylor and many others, right, of this kind of very unique moment where we could go in and explicitly demand, right, that school police be defunded, or explicitly talk about abolishing the police in schools, which was something that maybe even 2-3 months ago wasn't happening. And so recently at LAUSD, they got them to defund the LASPD department by, I want to say 35 million.
Yeah, right.
And so then the police chief resigned right after that.
Yeah, they lost their shits. Yeah. I'm wondering if you can take us a little bit back and define a few things for us. So when you're talking about the carceral state, right? Like, what does that mean to you? Like, how do you make sense of
that? Yeah. So thinking like very kind of, I guess if we're thinking about very like academically or theoretically, right? Like there's no kind of concise definition and folks kind of debate it and argue it, right? But at the core, I think what we all agree on, and it's also how I define it. And when I say I define it, I'm thinking about like, how I build on the work of like, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Victor Rios, Nikki Jones, Damon Sojourner, who else? Erica Miners and other folks, right? That I think of the carceral state as both having to interrogate, its prisons, right? So the physical aspect of it, prisons, detention centers, I'm thinking like ICE, right? ICE detention centers, prisons, juvenile detention center, to like all the kind of physical aspects of it. Its expansion, right? So how prisons expand, right? LA is like one of the prison capitals of the world. But also, I think more importantly, for me, the carceral state, or using the carceral state as a kind of analytic, is to also understand how its logics and practices have seeped into our everyday lives, right? So how these notions of like dispossession, punishment, criminalization, and policing are now very much part of our everyday practices and many of the institutions that we navigate, right? And so for me, like, for example, schools. So I work with youth who are all like 13 to 20. And so they're very much still in high school or connected to their high school experience, right? And so when I think about the carceral state, right, I also think about, for example, random searches, suspensions, for minor things, right? Like the policing and criminalization of highlighters, for example, like at a very like, and so I think both about the physical aspects of the carceral state, but also beyond its prison walls, right? To think about its logics and everyday kind of practices around disposition, punishment, and criminalization. And surveillance, right, too. And that I think one place that I'm always thinking about, and this is one of the ones that scares me the most, right, that you don't need police for these kind of carceral logics to operate no more, right? And so some schools, for example, they might only have one police officer, but one police officer is enough to kind of create this culture of punishment and criminalization, right? Some schools don't have police officers in them, but nonetheless, now teachers and administrators, right, upholding these kind of carceral logics. And so I was just interviewing like a youth for my dissertation from Boyle Heights, who they're 17, and this is on Tuesday, right? And then they were telling me about a time, right? They're like, yo, like, I showed up to school, got ran. So they're like, I fucking, they're literally their words, right? They're like, I hate admin, fucking hate them. And I'm like, why? Why do you hate admin? And he's like, I showed up to first period, got random searched by one of them. The bell rings. I go to my next class, and he was like, and then I'm getting randomly searched by another one. And so he's like, But I think what's important about that moment, right, is kind of that idea, right, that carceral logics operate beyond prison walls, right? And that for me, it's constantly thinking about how do they then interrupt young people's lives? How do they then shape gender, race, emotions, and so many other things?
Right. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're working with the idea of intersectionality?
Yeah.
Or would it be easier to think about, I don't know, like, is it easier for you to tell us maybe what does this mean for the intersection of gender? Or is it easier for you to first tell us how you're thinking about intersectionality?
I think it's easier for me to first tell you how I'm thinking about intersectionality.
Okay, let's do that.
So I use both intersectionality. So I use intersectionality in my work in multiple ways, right? So I think one of the main ways, not the main ones, right? I think at the core, I let go of it as an analytic in most of my work, right? And okay. So
first tell us what you mean by analytic.
Yeah. So as a way of analyzing, like, for example, my data or my findings, right? Or as a way of interpreting, literally, so when you used to do the glasses, the same youth that I was interviewing, at one point said intersectionality. And I'm like, yo, what do you mean by that? And he's like, it's like a pair of glasses, right? That you see the world. And I was like, this is perfect. A pair of, yeah. And so I think, so a bulk of my work, or at least the work that I'm doing right now, so I have a paper that I'm trying to finish and get published. And in that one, I let go of intersectionality as an analytic, right, to kind of analyze my, what I see, my data or my findings or the work that I'm still very much part of here in South Central around organizing, around policing, to think about how do young people themselves, right? How do these Black and Latinx youth themselves practice and use intersectionality as a racial politic, right? And so it's very much part of their vocabulary. Sometimes I'm talking to them or we're at meetings and they're like, youth liberation is intersectional, right? And so I'm very much...
Just hold on, just to make this clear. So when you're thinking about intersectionality, you're no longer thinking about how intersectionality informs the practices, but it's more about how these students are remaking ideas of intersectionality.
Hold on, let me overhold it. I think, I need some sunlight in here. I think it's both. I think I'm not trying to let go of, what I mean by letting go, I mean about letting go of current debates about the use of intersectionality and its definitions in the academy, right? So how academics are I guess I'm letting go of the academic arguments between people with PhDs, right? And to then think about intersectionality as a way of seeing the world that, as a practice that has existed outside of the act. Its origins don't, like, Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term, right? But the kind of work around it and the activist ways of being and modalities, especially the Black woman, right, and woman of color, have existed outside of the academy, right? And so Jennifer Nash, in one of her books, right at the end, she kind of ends it. She was like, we need to sometimes let go of the debates, the academic debates, to see how people outside of the academy, right, practice and use intersectionality, because they are, right? They are using it as a lens, as a way of seeing the world. They are using it as a practice. And so in the paper that I'm writing, for example, I talk about it as a collective action frame. So meaning that I'm arguing that young people use it as a way to diagnose the carceral state, right? How they experience it, how they're impacted, but also to be attuned to how young people's different social locations mediate that experience, right? I also talk about it as a motivational kind of frame, right? Where intersectionality motivates these young people to always think intergenerationally, right? And so they're always thinking about how how carcerality, that oftentimes they get motivated by the fact that I don't want my little brother or future generations, right? Future generations that haven't even been born yet to experience the same type of things that I'm experiencing. but also to make their experiences sometimes legible to adults who forget that they're young people, right? Or who forget. Um, yeah, and then the last kind of thing that I argue, right, is as a diagnostic frame, that intersectionality, uh, gives, or at least they're kind of using intersectionality, gives them tools to constantly be doing this work, and like, so they, motivates them to build coalitions, to work across, cross generationally, right? And so they're always think, like, for example, the other day, right, when I was talking to youth that I interviewed, his whole thing was like, the carceral state is so expansive that it requires us attacking it at multiple fronts, right? So while we're working on defunding the police, it's important that we build coalitions with people who are working around immigration detention, right? Or ICE, right? And or reproductive justice, right? And so they're always kind of thinking about, not the carceral state in terms of, like, I mean, they are thinking about the carceral state, but not only in terms of just their own experiences, right, as young men, but also like, how does criminalization and policing look across, right, place and space? How does that impact trans youth, for example? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so that's one news.
Yeah, keep going. This is great. This is awesome.
That's one use. That's one use of it that I use, right? And then at the other time, like at the other side, I also very much think about intersectionality. Or for me, intersectionality gives me tools to take very seriously, youth. So like the concept of youth, but youth as a social location, right? As a social, political, and contested location, right? And so literally thinking about age. And here this idea of thinking about youth as such really, and I have it right here, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, right?
Yeah.
And so Toni Morrison's first novel, like if you read the forward in the first few pages, she's talking about why she wrote the book, right? And then at one point she says, that her first book, she was trying to interrogate these ideas around youth, gender, and race, right? And so that's the other way I've been using intersectionality. And so here for sure, more as an analytic, right? That gives me tools to think about, youth as a social and political category, right? That sometimes there is experiences that are very specific to how youth, experience things, right? But this is one place that I'm still thinking with, I'm still sitting with. But I think it's really useful because, for example, when we think about the carceral state, if we take youth as a category seriously, right, then you begin to see how, for example, Black youth, right, are constantly being, like, they're, Jessica Tavia, they call it a youth continuum, right, where you are adultified by the carceral state, but then in other cases, like this weird kind of relationship between, youth and the carceral state. And so I use intersectionality in those ways. And I think about, like, the majority of my work has really been concerned with trying to take very seriously youth, right? Youth as young people, as social actors, as knowledge producers, but also youth as a political and social category that is constantly being contested, and that the young people themselves use to render visible their experiences with the carceral state.
Right. And a very specific point too, where all these things meet, right? And that we as a society have made that a category that's useful to push certain logics. Yeah.
Of criminalization, of punishment, of disposition. Yep.
Right. So the masculinity piece.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about, not so much, because now I'm thinking a lot, right? Of how you define masculinity, but maybe, actually give us a little bit of like how you think about masculinity, but also like, what is that relationship between ideas of masculinity and the carceral state, right? And here, I'm also thinking about how, and maybe you can clear this up for some of us, because a lot of the readings that we have been doing in our gender class allude to masculinity as something that's also embodied by female bodies, or right. And we read that with the Bettina Love, we read that with the Chenge in our class. So maybe how that is an interplay with the carceral state. If you can just enlighten us a little bit, or give us your thoughts on that.
Yeah. That's a good question, because I think my definition and understanding of intersectionality is also along those lines of something that's embodied, and more importantly, something that cannot simply be reduced to the biological, right? And so that it can't be reduced to, for example, boys being boys or man just being man, right? That's a very reductive understanding of masculinity, but it's often the kind of common discourse or the common language that we have or use outside, right? Like in popular discourse or in our communities, right? That we tend to kind of always situate masculinity as biological almost, right? Boy, that's what boys do. But the kind of history of genealogy of like masculinity research, right, is a lot of feminist challenging those kind of reductive understandings of masculinity. And for the most part, at the early part, at least the work that got recognized was a lot of white feminists. And so that really shaped the kind of trajectory of the field of masculinity studies. And it's a place where I constantly still, I'm thinking with, grappling with, and I'll come back to that in a bit though. But I think it's an important thing to recognize, right? That for sure there was important contributions by so many scholars, but the ones that got recognized and kind of gave, like, you know, in the academy were oftentimes white feminists. And so, but nonetheless, together, right, collectively, this challenging of masculinity as a reductive kind of boys, you know, that's what boys do, to then include what you just talked about as both the embodied aspects of it. And so for me, I think as a sociologist, right, I always think about masculinity as a social construct. And what I mean by that is masculinity as always situated, or not always situated, but always constructed how would I put it? As always, as non-biological. So in other words, as constructed through structures, through social relations, through cultural norms, through power. And then more recently in my work, I've been thinking about how does the carceral state shape that social construction process, right? Yeah. But I do think though that even though, you know, it's not biological, but that there is some kind of expectation sometimes around masculinity, and that there is cases and places and times where we could study or we could understand how people who deviate, right, from those kind of expectations do get penalized or punished or whatever it is, right? But in terms of like, if I was to give you like a concrete definition to how I think about masculinity, it's definitely a social construct, and meaning that it's not biological, but, you know, like I said, situated within structures of power, social locations, identities, cultural norms.
Espérame, let me get my cat before, because I'm having one like zoom. Hey, can I hear you, little tiger? ¿Qué iba a decir? So in the class, we didn't read hegemonic masculinity this time around. But some of the students in our class are familiar with it, right? And with the idea of toxic masculinity, right? And like the whole argument. And so I know that you've been, you know, kind of dealing and pushing back and trying to figure out like what aspects of it you're taking with you for your work, and which ones of them you're just kind of like, I don't know, this sounds a little too like white masculine deal. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your hesitations and your critiques of hegemonic masculinity, and why you think that might be kind of not the best way to think about masculinity.
Damn. So I'm working on a paper right now where I build on like what, kind of still a new field, but definitely a place of study and thinking, critical carceral studies. And so I offer it almost as a corrective, or as as a place where we could think about different ways to move forward with hegemonic masculinity. Um, so quick little, I'm gonna try to keep it short, right? Like introduction to hegemonic masculinity. It comes out of research and studies done in Australia in the early 1980s by sociologists, one of them being Connell, who was a sociologist in the sociology department here at UC Santa Cruz. I'm pointing over here like that's
over here.
not over here. uh, and it's one of the most influential theoretical frameworks that we have in masculinity research, or more broadly, what's being called, right, the men and masculinity studies. And so it really dominates the field. Like hegemonic masculinity as a theoretical framework is both used in social sciences, you see it in the humanities, and like mostly everybody uses it, right? And to kind of give you a little short definition, but maybe I can spend some time in our conversation just to find a little more. But arguably, hegemonic masculinity tries to get at this idea that a form of hegemonic masculinity is relational or See, I can't even pronounce this word. Legitimated through unequal relationships between women, femininity, and those who call subordinated masculinities, right? And so hegemonic masculinity is very much getting at the contextual rather than specific traits, right? But it's really interesting because, Kano kind of argues that only few men actually have a hegemonic masculinity, but that nonetheless it dictates, or it shapes a lot of our cultural, our behaviors and norms, and so forth, right? And I think the concept could be useful to think about maybe historical changes in terms of our understandings of masculinity and institutions, right? So, for example, schools, their role. It for sure has been useful to study white men.
Yeah. 100%.
So maybe it could still be useful to study white men. But I can tell you some of my hesitations with hegemonic masculinity that came up in the work, right? And so masculinity for me hasn't always been, so I didn't come into grad school thinking I was going to write a dissertation and study masculinity. It just came to be because of my research, right, and my work. So a lot of the work that the organizations that I work with and who are part of my dissertation, they're not only organizing young people, they're always concerned with questions around how do we heal, right? How do we engage young men in activist work? How do we engage them in activist work so that they're not reproducing the same kind of sexist logics from past social movements, right? And so it's this really interesting recognition of our civil rights leaders, but also like keeping it 100 and be like, yo, some of y'all are sexist though.
Right.
And so
it already starts at a different point, the hegemonic masculinity period.
Yeah. And so as I began to try to make sense of so I'm an ethnographer, right? So a lot of my field work and field notes and in my interviews, a couple of things came up for me. The first one was that even if maybe the theory or Connell's original intentions were good, the way it's been taken up in the field does a couple things that for me are not too useful, right? So the first one is that it creates these very reductive understandings of Black and Latino boys and young men, right? And so always kind of pointing to the gender character flaws of Black and Latino youth, right? Or young men, right? So always pointing to their qualities. And so in a lot of research that draws on Connell's work or hegemonic masculinity tends to always talk about Black and Latino masculinity in terms of like deficit frames, right? Or marginalized masculinities, subordinated, but never interrogating how power operates, right? And I think we could do both. I think we could think about, yes, how do men uphold patriarchy and how do they, privilege, right? Like from their maleness, I guess, or from being male identified. but also how do these kind of institutions shape this, right? So I'll give you one example. There's a piece a sociologist wrote about Chicago youth. And in that piece, they argue that Black youth, specifically Black young men, right, that to avoid policing and criminalization when they're like out in the streets, that sometimes they turn to cis women, Black women, to protect themselves, right? So let's say, they're walking down the street, police is coming, and this kind of fear of, like, oh shit, I'm gonna get stopped. So then they'll find, if there's a woman, a young Black woman next to them, right, that they walk up to them and they'll be like, can I walk with you, right? Because if the cops think that we're a couple, they're more likely to leave me alone than if I'm by myself, right? And so it's a really good piece. There's a lot of good data. And then they get to the discussion section, right? And so in the discussion section, they draw on Cano's work on hegemonic masculinity and kind of conclude something along the lines of, these Black young men are reinforcing hegemonic masculinity, right? Through their practices and going up to Black women, they're reinforcing hegemonic masculinity. And so for me, it was kind of like, I had to take a step back and I'm like, whoa, so we're not going to say nothing about the police? Like, we're not going to say nothing about the fear of policing and criminalization, right? So that's kind of one thing, right, for me. It's like, how does hegemonic masculinity, that Black and Latino young men, for me, and boys, fit very awkwardly into those theories and its kind of applications and genealogy in the past 20 years.
Right.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that it lacks the way that other powers are also interacting with ideas of masculinity.
Yeah. I just had lack but that too, it lacks the power. And so then the other part is that, the carceral state also hasn't been like heavily interrogated in that process, right? And it might not be Cano's fault, right? Because I think while carceral, if you look at carceral history, right, we see the expansion of policing and criminalization, right? But there's also something really interesting about U.S. history, where I think the late 1900s definitely marks a kind of beginning of like carceral expansion beyond prison walls, right, for young people. And so, like, I have specific examples where, for example, elders from Black Lives Matter talking to some of the youth organizers that I've worked with, and them kind of taking a step back and being like, yo, we've always been organizing against policing in the streets. We didn't have to organize against policing in our schools because they didn't exist the same way that they do, or they're not as present in our schools, right, as they are now. And Damien Sojourner, who you're going to read, writes about that, right? He writes about how LAUSD literally worked with LAPD to increase punitive practices in schools. And so to me, that's an area that we still got to reckon with, right? That carceral logics, like I said, very much shape our lives. And so to me, it's like, then they must also be shaping our understandings of gender and masculinity.
Exactly.
In the contemporary moment.
Right.
And then my last kind of issue with hegemonic masculinity is that it's left no room. It's elitist and white, like very white feminist nature has left no room for scholars of color, right? And so a lot of the Black and Latinx women, a lot of the Black and Latinx men who are writing about Black and Latinx gender and masculinity have had to always, or maybe by choice, deliberately, operate outside of that field, right? And so it's very, and there's some pieces out there on this topic, right, that it's even more recently for like trans masculinity folks who are looking at the masculinity of trans people, right? They've argued that something similar has happened to them, right? That the very elitist and white, or the lack of interrogation of whiteness in masculinity research, precisely in research that takes up Cano's hegemonic masculinity, does not leave room for them to think about trans masculinity. So they've had to operate outside of that. Yep.
Cool. There's two things I want to talk about before we end. One is, I know both of us think a lot about space, right? At this point, we're like, we're trending on the sides of geography, right? Because we've been thinking a lot about the context of our studies And one of the things we haven't done in our class for lack of time is really think about the way in which space influences our social interactions. Like that is just something we haven't tapped into our class. But I know that's something that we have a conversation about all the time, right? About how the context of South Central, right? Both of us being like hood kids from South Central and super proud, right? How South Central in itself is it has special dynamics, right? And in my work, you know, that's central to the study of Watsonville, right? That Watsonville is very like specific and constructed, right? And one of the conversations that we've started to have but haven't dug deeply into is how the role of gentrification, right, in defining how youth are either seeing themselves, how they're moving, but how they're starting to think about logics, about abolition, about identity. I mean, and I'm not into identity studies, right? But like really much how geography is central to the story. And so maybe you can talk a little bit about, I know we've shared stories about how gentrification is like really playing a role in this, right? Maybe how the context of South Central is very specific to this, right? But this idea of the urban and the agricultural is something that both of us are always kind of like, you know, they're not mutually exclusive, right? They're like functioning very similar. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about space. Yeah, just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'm writing it down so I don't forget.
Yeah, a little bit about,
No.
maybe you
No.
can tell us that one story you told us about that one kid being like, yo, now I gotta hustle, right? I
Yeah.
usually, yeah,
Right.
that story and
I
how.
had two that I'm gonna share. I think kind of highlight what I'm gonna answer. That's a really dope question because I think in some ways it builds on the previous question, right? About why I don't find hegemonic masculinity as the most useful right now for my work and my thinking, and for my thinking of Black and Latinx youth, right? Um, I mean, but then also all our conversations have really shaped my thinking. So it's like past 3 years, if
I
I
know,
could, we could,
but
if
both
we
of
could put it,
really,
if we could put it in a book, I
yeah,
could just call it the Andrea Vasquez Reader.
very much
Just
a South reader.
because, I mean, all our conversations have shaped my thinking.
Yeah,
Um, so okay, so thinking about space and masculinity, um, yeah. So the history of, and that's what I meant for me. Like critical carceral studies is a really good entry point to have a lot of these conversations for me, or gives me tools. Because critical carceral studies for me is interdisciplinary, right? And so it allows me to go a little bit beyond sociology. It also means that I must reckon with like the history, with the spatial dynamics. But because it's interdisciplinary, then I could draw on the work of like, people who do think about space and place, and often, geographers. Um, um, and so that's what I was saying when I was saying earlier that Black and Latino young men fit awkwardly into theories of hegemonic masculinity and their applications. That's one example of space and place, right? And so, for example, before I start though, one of the kind of things about hegemonic masculinity though that there's always kind of this assumption that men or young men, these aspirations of power, right? So there's the aspirations to like a hegemonic form of masculinity. And to me, what I'm finding, right, that's not the case. Well, that's not necessarily what I'm seeing, right? And so that example with gentrification. So what Andrea's talking about, or your Professor Vasquez was talking about, is that one time, right? I know, future Dr. Vasquez. One time I was having a conversation with it was kind of like a little, we're sitting at a table and we're talking and we're getting ready for a campaign. I can't remember which one, and I asked a bunch of, it was mostly Black youth, and then I think there was one Latinx youth or two. And I was like, yo, like, how do you think we could recruit more young men of color into this work, right? Into this organizing work? And their response was like, well, no, it's because, it's kind of hard, right? Because sometimes you don't get paid to do this work. And I'm like, kind of just keep pushing. I was like, well, what do you mean, right? What are you trying to get at? And he's like, well, a lot of my homies have to live the fast life. right? And so, you know, in a lot of literature and work, we've heard about this fast life, right? About gangs and how it shapes lives. And I'm like, cool, tell me more, right? Tell me more about this fast life. What is this fast life? And me being from South Central, you know, I have my own kind of ideas and assumptions. And there are definitely assumptions because I had to like take a step back, right? And also think that my experiences or the experiences of my cousins or brothers who are like 10 years older than some of these young people, right? They're also different. And so then he goes on to say, right, like, he gives me a very specific example of some of his friends having to turn, you know, to the fast life to make money to be able to pay rent, right? And so he goes on, like, he's like, for example, and then he names somebody, he's like, you know, both of their parents already work full-time jobs and their rent just went up by so-and-so. Who's gonna give them those extra $200-300? They're already working 2 jobs, right? Or they're already working multiple jobs. They're already like maxed out. Like they're already tired. They're already working. They're already doing all they can to be able to pay rent. And now you got another, you know, and because gentrification is hitting South Central really hard, right? Especially in the Crenshaw area right now. And so then his idea of the fast life was, right, that his friends or some of his friends are having to turn to the fast life or this idea of having to be providers, right, for the family. Because then they just need to pay rent. Like they literally have to survive, right? They have to have a roof over their head. And so for me, like original kind of coming in, if I was to come in, or if a different scholar was to come in, very hegemonic masculinity lens, they would have read that as a moment where these young men are trying to be providers because they're power, right? There's something about power there and they're trying to obtain power. And my read of it is not that, right? It's just that literally gentrification, the rise of rent, the rent costs going up, right? Pushing these young men to kind of step into these symbolic provider roles. And I think I'm saying symbolic right now because I think sometimes they don't necessarily always step into the, provider roles, but they all kind of aspire to them because of their experiences with gentrification, right? I had another one, very similar story, right? I need to work, I need to do this, I need to provide for my family. Never, and this is during the interview, never once during the interview did he mention that his mom had been deported. And the only reason I found out was because at the end, I gave him $50 gift cards. And I had one that was like, those generic gift cards that you could use anywhere. And he's like, oh, I'm going to take this one because my mom got deported 2 weeks ago, right? And so that's the other place that I kind of see these moments of like these young men developing these understandings or wanting to be providers or step into these very masculine roles, maybe per se, not because of power or aspirations of power, literally because of the carceral state, right? And gentrification. And oftentimes we go on retreats at least twice a year. And I remember one time to kind of just signal to like the far reach of the carceral state, right? We were in a healing circle. So it's like 20, 30 young men. We're all in a circle. And it's Friday night. We went to Big Bear. Our bus didn't break down this time. So we got there like at 9 a.m. So we had enough time to do. It always breaks down. It always breaks down. And we're always stuck in the middle of the mountain. But we got there at 9 a.m. And so we're like, let's go do little introductions and just in case people don't know each other and do the circle. And as we're doing introductions, right, eventually the kind of beginning sentence for all of them was like, oh, just like everybody else, my dad's in jail, my mom's incarcerated, my dad's been deported, right? So this really complete restructuring of the family in some cases. So these are places that I'm still thinking with, right? Like I'm still sitting with. These are moments that I'm still trying to make sense of. But there are definitely moments that led me to think that hegemonic masculinity wasn't the most useful framework for me. In that some theories of gender that we have right now, right, are not the most useful. And I forgot who it was, but black scholar was like, a lot of these concepts and logics, even in academia, are very much tied to whiteness, and sometimes we got to come up with new ones. And I think this is that moment for me, right? That how do I do justice to that, right? To those experiences, those moments where I literally 20 to 30, 14, 13, all the way up to 20-year-olds talking about these very traumatic moments, these moments that completely restructure their families, these moments that rob them of their time, right? So I've also been thinking a lot about racialized time, right? Because not all youth have to spend time figuring out how to pay their bills and survive and make money. And so I've been thinking about this idea of like racialized time a lot, but also racialized emotions, right? That some of this is very much tied, or these experiences are very much tied to the carceral state, and their experiences in them, and that of their families.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, last question, because all of this has been pretty awesome. I've been enjoying our conversation. But we're gonna finish with abolition. That's the end. I think it's really like weird, at least for both of us, I think, because indirectly, or we've been kind of sorting out with these ideas of abolition for some time, right? So it's like it's weird to be in this moment where everybody wants to talk about abolition all of a sudden, right? But we've been kind of toying out with that. And what we've been starting our class with women of color feminism, a lot of what we've been talking about, and particularly Black women, is they just listen to Power of the Erotic, right? So that joy, right, of being with one another, that finding those joys that you're rubbed from, right, by the carceral logics, right? And like abolition being, I think about abolition not so much about this moment, right, but about like the future, right? And it's that little like weird ambiguity of like not knowing what that future holds, and not necessarily being hopeful, but really like delving into this practice of being imagined and otherwise, right? So I know that, as grad students, when we're getting to that point where we're like, oh man, this is too much, we hold on ourselves as researchers also to those moments when we're all like, fuck yeah, like where that joy comes through. Yeah. And so I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what that looks like for you, as a researcher, as a scholar, as someone from South Central, but also like how the youth are thinking about that in their work, right? Yeah. I'm wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I've gotten this question several times now in different contexts. Or sometimes people have asked me like, oh, how do you find joy? How do you make time for joy during grad school? And I always be turned to this work, and they're like, all right, cool. I don't know, okay, you do organizing work, but when do you find moments of joy? Right. I'm like, no, this is literally it, right? This is it. Exactly. So I honestly believe, and you know this, right? Because we talked about that. I wouldn't be able to continue in the program. I wouldn't be able to get this PhD if I wasn't doing the work that I'm doing with these youth, right? With these Black and Latinx youth. And I say that along multiple lines. The first one being that it's allowed me to be a different kind of sociologist, right? And so what I mean by that is that it's allowed me I am not invested in only publishing about youth activism, about masculinity, right? I am very much committed to the material conditions of these young people that I work with, right? And so doing this work with them has allowed me to move beyond just kind of this very traditional academic who just publishes, gets tenure, and becomes a famous scholar because of their work, right? But instead that, I very much have a role in this work and play a role, even if it is as a researcher sometimes, right, for them. And so I've done research projects for them. I lead projects with them. We've collected our own data. We have over 3,000 surveys on policing, community safety, and so forth in South Central. That it's not going to be work that I publish for my dissertation or articles. It's work that I have done and thoroughly enjoyed with the young people. The second thing is that, like, doing this work, they've taught me so much about always having to find, like, it's that about the importance of always finding time to celebrate, to be in community with each other, to find joy, right? There's also something really beautiful about the emotional aspect of this space. And that's why I was like, I'm also thinking about emotions and how to complicate masculinity with emotions, right? Because, you know, I don't know, they're just like, these theories don't capture when these young men log on and be like, what's up, beautiful faces, right? Or like the middle, like when I'm about to jump off a car, right? And I say jump off a car right now because, you know, COVID and we're all in Zoom, but this happens in person. Like this happens in person too, right? Of like, yo, I love you, right? These really moments of like vulnerability that they have. Um, 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 you know, that constantly, even me, right, as a PhD student, they're constantly asking me like, so how's your dissertation, right? And of course they clown on me all the time and be like, wow, you've been writing this shit for forever, right? But that this, you know, having this group of young people who are constantly checking in on me, right? I'm like, yo, so how's your dissertation, right? How's it coming along, right? Did you write something new? Has been hella beautiful. But I think most important, like I said, is that reminder of collective healing and collective joy and collective finding these collective moments to celebrate is so key in their work, right? And so, like, for example, we've had, like, let's say we had a day long of protests, right? Or a day long meeting trying to plan out our next campaign. That I know that every single time at the last hour, they're gonna pop out with either like a talent show and people sign up and go up there and perform their music and their poems, right? Um, or something. You know, it's one of the retreats. We had one youth who like did this whole Vogue dance, right? Like these moments of always by like, we gotta celebrate, we gotta like we just gotta find time to celebrate. And for them, like that's a radical act in itself, right? Just like to be away from the gaze of the carceral state, to be away from the gaze of whiteness, to be away from all these kind of things and find these moments, right? And I think it's an important lesson because I think a lot of like, if we look back at the history of social movements and civil rights movements, so many movements, this aspect of collective healing was sometimes missing, right? People devoted, or maybe if it wasn't me, yeah, we could go into a whole conversation about capitalism, neoliberalism. We're not, but yeah. But you know, sometimes even in organizing work, we kind of fall into this trap of like, we just gotta work, right? And they're like, yeah, cool, we work, and then have some fun, right? We work, and we celebrate. We work, and find joy. And that's been very key to their, even at the defunding the police, they had a DJ, right? Like the last LAUSD defunding the police rally, right? They had a DJ. At one point, one of the youth led us through an exercise activity. Like, you know, these very forms of collective joy and healing and celebration are super important. And I think also very key and central to their visions of abolition, right? Yeah. Constantly dreaming about, damn, what if all young people had a space like this one, right? And the recognition that if we want all young people to have a space of joy and celebration, that when we gotta abolish like these.
No. You were like, I'm fucking ready. Yeah. So we were talking about joy, youth, DJ,
abolition.
Saying I love you. You know, and one of the things that it makes me think about too is how at the end of the day, for a lot of these youth, that joy is what drives the work, right? Is the desire to see the well-being of your community. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why Robin D. Kelly, right, in Freedom Dreams. If you haven't read it, check it out. And I was just giving somebody feedback on a paper that was on undocumented youth activists, and the kind of quotes that this person had in the article, really beautiful and powerful. Like there was one where one youth was like, oh man, could I pull it up? Let's see if I can find it. But so she had this quote of this like undocumented youth activist who gets arrested, right? And then she's like talking about their experience about to get arrested, and they're like, they came into the building, I'm about to get arrested, and I'm just kind of like reading the quote, and I'm like, oh shit, this is getting, and then they're like, and it was the most beautiful thing ever, you know, and so like this build up to document, I'm about to get arrested, and you're like, oh shit, just, and then it's just like, and I think it was a young woman, I think and she's like, but it was the most beautiful thing ever, right? And then she describes it being the most beautiful thing ever, because she's like, in that moment, I knew that my ancestors were there, that my community was there, that even though it was about 6 or 7 of us undocumented youth activists who were about to get arrested, that my community was there, my ancestors, my family. And she just kind of like, right, went over like this kind of all the people who were there with her, you know, not physically there, but people that she was thinking about. And it was just like, I remember reading it and getting chills. And when I was giving this person feedback, right, my voice starts to crack a little because I read the quote out, you know, read her quote out loud. And I told her, I was like, I was like, what if we took very seriously what young people dream about, right? And so like their dreams for the future, their dreams for now, right? Because there's something really beautiful about how they constantly, or at least, that I see that this constant reimagining of what schooling could look like, right? What would it mean to center abolition in schooling, right? Um, how different their neighborhoods will look like, right? Like, so they're kind of always dreaming about, a place where I feel safe and happy wouldn't include the police at every corner, right? A place where I feel safe and happy also includes, people who we don't deem worthy of saving sometimes, or maybe not saving, but worthy of including in our visions of liberation, right? And so they always do this work of like dreaming, which I think is very central and key to the kind of abolition work that we want to do and imagine. Because for them, it's like in that dreaming, they're also pointing to the importance that abolition, right, is not only about defunding the police per se, it's also about having a vision or of what comes next, right? And for me, like in their dreaming, we get some of those previews of what could potentially come next, right? Cause like, man, I'm telling you, those moments where they're well, we're like at a super rigid meeting with a bunch of other organizations, right? And staff or founders, and they're like, all right, for our check-in, we're gonna do a soul training. And so everybody gotta get up and dance, right? Now imagine if we were getting up and dance everywhere, like in our school, and so I don't know. It just, I always think about those moments as like really important moments and windows into what our futures could look like.
So, and then, yeah, man, I think we covered everything. I know that the students are going to really love and enjoy this talk. And so thank you. Thank you
I
for
send me questions if they have any.
Yeah, I'll have them. Is it okay to share your info with them?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. I'll do that. And like I mentioned to you that Kim might have her class watch some, so I'll tell her to share your info too. But yeah, thank you so much. This was great. I think you connected a lot of things for a lot of folks here. Masculinity was something that we didn't really touch on directly, but we've been thinking about through the idea of femininity to some extent. But putting it together with the carceral logics and having that definition is definitely going to be super helpful for folks. And also, I think, both of us, I consider you to be one of my diehard friends, homie. And so anytime that I have the opportunity to have a good person share their work, it's always a pleasure for me. So thank you for coming to our
thank you for inviting me. It's been dope because I think it's, sometimes you just gotta speak it out loud to be able to make connections. Like I was taking notes the whole time because I'm like, oh, that's right. Like, the kind of questions that you're asking me, I was like, that's right. Like there's something there.
Yeah. I'm glad this was helpful for you too. And so I'll tell them to send you questions if they have any. They're a great class. And so muchas gracias.
No, I appreciate you. Thank you.
All right.